There are the battles that everyone knows: Normandy, Stalingrad, the Battle of Britain, Midway. These are the battles that appear in the documentaries and the school curricula and the anniversary ceremonies. The battles that have become shorthand for the war itself. The names carrying the weight of everything that was at stake in the conflict that shaped the modern world. And then there are the battles that saved those battles. The ones that happened earlier, in places that the larger narrative has trouble accommodating, fought by people whose names are not on the memorials that the famous battles produced, whose sacrifice made the famous victories possible but whose own story has been compressed into footnotes, or omitted entirely from the accounts that the public remembers. The Battle of the Atlantic is one of those stories. Not a single battle, in truth, but a campaign that lasted from the first day of the war in September tahun 1939 to its last day in May 1945. Fought continuously and at significant cost across 6 years in the most hostile and unforgiving environment that men have ever chosen to fight in. It was fought in the North Atlantic, in water so cold that a man overboard without immediate rescue had a survival expectancy measured in minutes rather than hours, in weather conditions that would have grounded aviation and halted ground operations. But that the men on both sides of this campaign had no more choice but to endure because the sea did not offer the option of waiting for better conditions. It was fought with weapons and the tactics that both sides were developing as they went, learning from each battle and each sinking and each survival what worked and what did not. Adapting faster than their opponents where they could and dying when they could not adapt fast enough. It was fought at a level of sustained individual and collective courage that the land battles that got more attention could not entirely match, because the land soldier who survives a battle can sleep in a building or a trench and eat a meal and ride a letter home. The sailor in a convoy crossing the North Atlantic in the winter of 1942 was never, for the duration of the crossing, in a position where the threat had diminished to the point of allowing full relaxation, full sleep, full release of the specific sustained tension of knowing that beneath the water were things that were trying to kill him, and that the first sign of their success would be a torpedo impact that might give him seconds to reach the deck before the ship went down. The Battle of the Atlantic was the campaign that determined whether Britain could stay in the war. It determined whether the American forces and the American supplies that eventually enabled every Allied offensive in every theater could reach the theaters where they were needed. It determined the pace and the possibility of every major Allied operation from the North African landings of 1942 to the Normandy invasion of 1944. Eisenhower could not have planned the day if the Atlantic shipping lanes were not open. The Sherman tanks and the aviation fuel and the ammunition and the food that sustained the Allied armies in Europe could not have reached Europe if the U-boats had succeeded in their campaign. Winston Churchill said, after the war, that the only thing that truly frightened him during the conflict was the U-boat peril. He had lived through the Blitz. He had overseen the retreat from Dunkirk. He had sat in the war cabinet through the worst moments of the Desert Campaign and the fall of Singapore and the disasters of 1942 and 1943. And what he said truly frightened him was the thing that could have ended Britain's ability to fight before any of those other crises became crises. The campaign in the Atlantic that was quietly and systematically trying to sever the supply lines without which everything else was impossible. To understand the Battle of the Atlantic, you have to begin with the specific strategic situation that made it possible and necessary. Britain in 1939 was not self-sufficient in food or in the raw materials needed to sustain a war economy. The United Kingdom imported approximately 55 million tons of goods per year before the war, including over 50% of its food and virtually all of its oil. The merchant shipping that carried these imports was the literal foundation of Britain's ability to function as a modern industrial state, and it was the foundation of its ability to fight. Germany understood this from the beginning. Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, had argued before the war that a sustained campaign against British merchant shipping was the strategic key to defeating Britain. He had not been given the resources to build the force he believed was necessary for this campaign. Adolf Hitler, who thought in continental rather than maritime terms and who believed the war with Britain would be short, had prioritized the army and the Luftwaffe in the pre-war rearmament program. The Kriegsmarine entered the war in 1939 with 57 U-boats, of which only 20 to the 27 were suitable for Atlantic operations at any given time. A force that was far below what Raeder believed was needed but that would prove, in the hands of commanders like Karl Dönitz, to be more effective than the numbers alone would suggest. Karl Dönitz commanded the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine from its beginning and he was the operational genius, if that word can be used without endorsing anything about the regime he served. Behind the campaign that came closer to defeating Britain than any German land operation ever managed. Dönitz had served in submarines in the First World War, had been captured when his submarine was sunk in 1918, and he had spent the years between the wars thinking about how submarine warfare should be conducted differently from how it had been conducted in that conflict. His answer was the Wolfpack, the coordinated attack by multiple submarines on a single convoy, a tactic that the First World War's technology had made impossible but that the interwar development of radio communications made feasible. The Wolfpack tactic was conceptually simple and operationally demanding. Submarines on patrol in the Atlantic would be spread across the likely convoy routes. When one submarine sighted a convoy, it would not attack immediately. It would shadow the convoy, reporting its position, speed, and the course to Dönitz headquarters at Lorient on the French Atlantic coast, and Dönitz would vector other submarines in the area toward the convoy's projected position, building up a concentration of boats that could attack simultaneously or in coordinated waves that overwhelmed the convoy's escorts. The mathematics of the tactic were straightforward. A convoy with 3 escorts defending against 1 submarine had reasonable odds. The same convoy defending against 8 submarines attacking from multiple directions simultaneously had much worse odds. And the escorts that were forced to respond to attacks from multiple bearings could not maintain the disciplined defensive patterns that made individual escorts effective. The fall of France in June 1940 transformed the strategic situation in the Atlantic in ways that Dönitz had not anticipated but immediately exploited. With the French Atlantic ports, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Bordeaux, available as U-boat bases, the operational range of the German submarine fleet was extended by over 500 miles, eliminating the time that submarines had previously spent transiting the North Sea to reach the Atlantic and allowing them to spend significantly more time in the operational areas where the convoys ran. Dönitz moved his headquarters to Lorient, and the period from mid-1940 to the end of 1941 became what German submarine crews called the Glückszeit, the happy time, when the combination of extended range, limited elite escort capability, and the tactical advantage of surface night attacks made convoy after convoy vulnerable to destruction. The happy time produced losses that, if they had been publicly known in Britain at the time, might have produced a political crisis. In the 6 months from July to December 1940, the U-boat sank over 300 merchant ships, approximately 2 million tons of shipping. The losses were not replacing themselves. No merchant ship construction was insufficient to offset the sinkings, and the escort forces available to protect the convoys were inadequate in numbers, in technology, and in the specific tactical training that effective anti-submarine warfare required. The specific technology problem was radar. In 1940 and through much of 1941, the Allied escorts defending the convoys had limited ability to detect submerged submarines at range. Sonar, then called the SDIC, could detect a submerged submarine at ranges of up to 1,500 yards in good conditions, but the conditions in the North Atlantic were rarely good. More critically, the German tactic of surface night attacks exploited a specific gap in SDIC capability, the inability to detect a submarine on the surface at night. When a submarine's low profile made visual detection in the dark extremely difficult, the wolf packs attacked on the surface at night and submerged during the day, exploiting precisely the technological limitations of the escorts they were attacking. The men on both sides of this campaign during the happy time and the years that followed were young. In many cases very young, and they were dying at rates that the sanitized public accounts of the war did not fully communicate to the civilian populations watching from the shore. The average age of U-boat crew was 23 years. The U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of service in any armed force in the entire war. Approximately 75% of all men who served in U-boats were killed. Of the 39,000 men who served in German submarines during the war, approximately 28,000 died. The survivors, the men who came home, were the exception, and many of them came home carrying the specific psychological damage of years in an enclosed metal cylinder in an ocean that was trying to kill them while other men dropped explosives into the water above their heads. The Allied merchant sailors were not uniformed military personnel for much of the war. They were civilian employees of shipping companies who kept sailing convoys across the North Atlantic while the casualty rates made their occupation statistically more dangerous than any branch of the armed forces. Over 30,000 Allied merchant sailors died in the Battle of the Atlantic. Many of them were never found. The North Atlantic's depth and its temperature and its current patterns mean that the majority of those who went into it when their ships went down did not come back to the surface in any form that could be recovered or identified. They are simply gone, in a way that is different from the men who died on land and who are, in most cases, in graves that can be found and marked. The technological competition at the heart of the Battle of the Atlantic was one of the most consequential in the history of modern warfare. Each innovation by one side produced a countermeasure from the other that then required a further innovation. A cycle that continued throughout the campaign and that determined its outcome as directly as any individual battle or commander. The introduction of centimetric radar in Allied escort vessels and patrol aircraft in 1942 and 1943 was the single most decisive technological development of the campaign. The earlier metric wavelength radar sets had been detectable by a German receiver device called the METOX, which could alert a submarine to the radar transmission before the radar operator detected the submarine, giving the U-boat commander warning to dive before the aircraft reached attack range. The centimetric radar, operating on a wavelength that the METOX could not detect, removed this warning. U-boat commanders began losing their submarines to aircraft attacks that arrived without any prior indication of the aircraft's approach. The survival rate in the Bay of Biscay, where the submarines transited between the French bases and the Atlantic, collapsed in the spring of 1943. The Leylight, a powerful searchlight fitted to aircraft operating in coordination with centimetric radar, addressed the night attack problem from the air. An aircraft that detected a surface submarine on centimetric radar could approach in darkness without its detection until the last seconds, when the light illuminated the target for the final attack run. The combination of centimetric radar and the light turned the surface at night from the U-boats before the attack environment into a distrap. Very long-range aircraft were another critical technological and operational development. The gap in the middle of the Atlantic, the area beyond the range of land-based aircraft from both sides, had been the primary hunting ground for wolf packs through 1942 and into 1943, a space of ocean where convoys had no more air cover and where the submarines could operate with significantly reduced risk from aircraft attack. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, modified with additional fuel tanks for extended range and fitted with centimetric radar and depth charges, was the aircraft that closed the gap. When the very long-range Liberators entered service with Coastal Command, and with the U.S. Navy's patrol squadrons in the spring of 1943, the Mid-Atlantic Gap ceased to exist as an area of reduced risk for the submarines. The intelligence dimension of the Battle of the Atlantic was as significant as the technological one. The breaking of the German naval Enigma codes by the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, one of the most consequential intelligence achievements in the history of warfare, provided Allied convoy routing authorities with the ability, when Enigma was readable, to redirect convoys away from the waiting wolf packs. The Kriegsmarine's naval Enigma variant, Hydra, used for U-boat communications, was broken in the summer of 1941 and provided months of intelligence advantage before the Germans introduced a more secure variant. The introduction of the four-rotor Enigma machine for U-boat communications in February 1942 created an 11-month blackout during which Bletchley Park could not read U-boat traffic. And this blackout coincided with the Second Happy Time, the American Coastal Campaign, and the worst period of Allied losses. The capture of German naval Enigma materials was therefore not merely a coup for cryptanalysis but a matter of operational urgency at the highest level. The capture of the Wazir ship M. Ensign in May 1941, and the boarding of the U-110 by HMS Bulldog in the North Atlantic on May 19, 1941 produced Enigma materials and books that were of incalculable operational value to Bletchley Park. The men who conducted those operations at sea, in conditions of extreme danger and against the specific hazard of the submarine scuttling charges, understood that what they were retrieving was important, but none of them could be told how important. Security around the Enigma secret was so tight that none of the men who died ensuring its success never knew what they had given their lives to protect. The turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic came in May 1943, a month that historians of the campaign have identified as the critical inflection point with a precision that most battles do not allow. In May 1943, the combination of centimetric radar, very long-range aircraft, improved escort tactics, and the rating of naval Enigma produced a catastrophic reversal of the previous 2 years' loss rates. 41 U-boats were sunk in May 1943 alone. The equivalent losses in previous months had been 6, 8, 12, significant but sustainable from the perspective of the Kriegsmarine's replacement rate. 41 was not sustainable. Dönitz withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes on May 24 ke 1943. He called it temporary. It was not temporary. The U-boats returned to the Atlantic in subsequent months with new equipment, new countermeasures, no acoustic torpedoes designed to home on propeller noise. But the strategic balance of the campaign had shifted permanently in May 1943 and it did not shift back. The losses continued. The convoys got through. The supplies kept flowing. And in June 1944, the Allied forces that crossed the Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history were supplied, equipped, and supported by the Atlantic shipping lanes, whose security had been established at enormous cost in the 3.5 years of campaign that preceded it. The Battle of the Atlantic produced individual stories of heroism and the endurance that the campaign's statistical scale tends to obscure. Captain Frederick John Walker, the Royal Navy's most successful anti-submarine commander, developed the tactical doctrines for escort groups that became the foundation of Allied anti-submarine warfare in the critical period of 1943 hingga ke 1944. His second support group sank more submarines than any comparable Allied formation. Andy Walker himself died of a cerebral thrombosis in July 1944. Exhausted by years of operational service at Apache that his physical constitution eventually could not sustain. He was 51 years old. He had spent most of the war at sea. The merchant sailors who kept sailing after the convoys they had previously sailed in were decimated, who went back to the North Atlantic months after watching their shipmates die in it, whose employment contracts technically allowed them to refuse hazardous duty but who in practice kept going because the alternative was to leave the ships unmanned and the supplies undelivered. These men received less recognition during the war and after it than any comparably exposed and comparably courageous group of participants in the conflict. The merchant navy was not treated as a uniform service for most of the war, its sailors not entitled to the same benefits as military personnel, its casualties not counted in the same official tallies, its contribution acknowledged in political speeches without the material recognition that the speeches implied. The post-war recognition of the Battle of the Atlantic as the campaign that made everything else possible has been gradual and incomplete. The naval historians have argued for its centrality since the 1950s. The popular understanding of the Second World War has been slower to incorporate it, partly because its nature, a campaign of attrition fought at sea over years rather than a decisive battle with a clear and dramatic narrative, resists the kind of storytelling that popular history finds most accessible, and partly because the secrecy maintained around the enigma secret until 1974 meant that the full story of how the Allies won the intelligence war at sea could not be told publicly for 30 years after the campaign ended. The full story, now available in the archives and documented in a scholarly literature of considerable depth, is a story that deserves the same place in the public understanding of the Second World War as the Normandy landings or the Battle of Britain, not because it was more heroic or more costly, though the cost was enormous and the heroism consistent and documented, but because without it, neither Normandy nor the Battle of Britain's survival would have meant anything. The Spitfires that saved Britain in the summer of 1940 needed the Atlantic convoys to bring the aluminum that built them. The American forces that turned the tide of the war needed the Atlantic to be crushable. Everything the war produced on the Allied side, every victory, every liberation, every advance toward the end, required the Atlantic shipping lanes to function, and the men who made them function are the invisible foundation under every monument and every ceremony that the war's conclusion produced. The North Atlantic is always cold. In winter, it is something that the language of temperature cannot fully convey. A cold that is not merely atmospheric but hydraulic, a cold with weight and mass and momentum, enters a vessel through every gap and joint and forces itself against any human warmth that tries to maintain itself against it. The men who crossed it in convoy during the worst years of the campaign crossed it in this cold for 6 to 12 days at a time, sleeping in shifts, keeping watch in conditions that would have been described as uninhabitable in any peacetime context. Knowing that the ships ahead and behind them in the convoy column might not be sure when morning came and that the same might be true of their own ship, they kept crossing it, year after year, convoy after convoy, in conditions that deteriorated in every direction simultaneously. The sea worse, the weather worse, the submarines more numerous, the losses more catastrophic, and they kept crossing it because the alternative was to stop and allow the Atlantic to become the world that Germany needed it to be. They did not allow it. That refusal is what made everything else possible. It is the invisible act of collective will at the foundation of every Allied victory of the Second World War, and it happened in the cold and the dark of the North Atlantic. Out of sight of the cameras and the correspondence and the ceremonies, carried by men whose names are mostly not on the monuments and whose graves are mostly the sea itself. The sea does not give those graves back, but it does not forget them either. The cold and the dark that received them are still there, unchanged by anything that has happened in the world above the water since they went in. And the ships keep crossing. Different ships, different cargoes, different world, but the same Atlantic, and beneath its surface, in the specific cold and the dark of its deepest places, the evidence of what it cost to keep those lanes open is still there. 430 submarines on the floor of the Atlantic, and the 30,000 merchant sailors who went with their ships, and the 28,000 German submariners who died in the same cold water fighting the same campaign from the other side. The ocean keeps no more score. It received both sides with the same impartiality it offers every human activity conducted upon it. It remains indifferent to the outcome. We cannot afford to be